Hello, I'm Michael Korenblit. I'm here talking today with the Oklahoman about Yom HaShoah, which we are going to be commemorating this Sunday, April the 27th. Both of my parents were Holocaust survivors from a small little town in Poland. My parents came from a small little town in Poland, a place called Hrubieszów, a town of about 20,000 people. About 55% were Christian, 11,500 or so, about 45%, about 8,500 were Jews. Jews had lived in this area of Poland for about over 300 years. Both my parents were born in this little town. My dad came from an immediate family of his mother, father, 2 older brothers, 3 younger sisters. The rest of their relatives were scattered around Poland and right across the border in the Soviet Union. My mom came from an immediate family of her mother, father, and elderly sick aunt who lived with them, 3 other sisters and 3 brothers. The rest of her family was scattered throughout Poland. Both families, if you did from the grandparents to the distant cousins, had about 40 members total in them. My dad's father owned a couple of mills in the area, which meant all the farmers, whether they were Jews or Christians, would bring their goods to him to process it so they could take it to market to sell. So because of that, my dad and his family got to know a number of Christians very well, 3 of them who play a very important role in my parents' story. On my mother's side of the family, her father was a handyman, a bricklayer, a builder. And for a while, that also helped save his life because of the work that he did actually for the Nazis and what was going on. They were boyfriend and girlfriend before the war ever started. My mom will tell you, or she would have before she passed away, that when she first laid eyes on him in elementary school, that she knew that that was the person she wanted to be with for the rest of her life. And I say that because, in large part, that's one of the reasons she was able to survive in the camps, especially when they became separated. My dad, on the other hand, had that male ego that we have and said, yeah, she was cute and he liked her, but he liked looking around at all the other young girls. But finally, they became boyfriend and girlfriend, and that was the situation on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded. My mom was just over 14 years old, and my dad was 14 when the Nazis invaded. They went through the same thing that the Jews in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia did when the Nazis took them over, as far as the laws being initiated against the Jews in Poland. And eventually the Nazis initiated the Star of David that they had to wear. My dad's father became concerned for his oldest 2 sons, not because he thought anything was going to happen, because nobody had any concept of what was going to happen over the next 5.5 years. But he was afraid they might be drafted into the military or sent away to work or something, so he sent them across the border into the Soviet Union to stay with relatives there. But because my dad was only 14, I thought it was best that he stayed with the family. Eventually, the Nazis moved the Jews into the ghettos in my parents' hometown. There were 3 different ghetto areas. The male Jews between the ages of 13 and 65 had to work for the Nazis every day from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening. At that point, then, the curfew was in effect, so they had to be in the house, couldn't be out. The only day they had off was Sunday, and you were confined into the ghettos on that day. So this was a problem for my dad as far as seeing his girlfriend. So he waited until he knew that his parents were asleep one night, and then he proceeded to sneak out of his house, avoided the Nazi guards in the ghetto, crawled under the barbed wire fence of his ghetto, went around the city under the barbed wire fence of my mother's ghetto, avoided the Nazi guards, and snuck into her house so he could spend the evening there with her. And then he would sneak back early in the morning so he'd be there in time to go to work with his father the next day. And he used to do this every night so that he could be with her. It was the Nazis began rounding up small groups of Jews and started taking them away. Usually they were the lawyers, the doctors, the teachers, the rabbis, groups of 20, 25 at a time. And when anybody ever asked where they were being taken, they were always informed that they were being resettled in another part of Poland. So one Saturday night, when my dad had done his usual thing and snuck over to my mom's house, he told her that he wasn't going to stay there that night. Instead, he was going to sneak out of the ghetto, and he was going to follow the Nazis to see where they were taking these small groups of Jews. And my mother, his girlfriend at the time, said she wanted to go with him. So they took off their armbands with their Star of David on them. My dad snuck the two of them out of the ghetto, and they waited about a mile outside of the city, a ways from the road so they wouldn't be seen. And about mid-morning that Sunday, the Nazis came marching down the road with Polish Christians who were collaborating with the Nazis, and about 25 Jews or so. And my mom and dad followed them at a safe distance for a while so they wouldn't be seen for about a mile, mile and a half down the road. And then the Nazis left the road and went into this big open field. And my mom and dad went into this little forest area, and they laid down on the ground in the brush so they wouldn't be seen. And they watched as the Nazis marched these Jews up to two large holes that had been dug in the ground. And then they watched as the Nazis proceeded to shoot them and throw the Jews into those holes. And then they watched as the Nazis and the Christian Poles who were collaborating with them filled up those holes with dirt. And my parents would have told you to the day that they died, in 5.5 years, and everything that they experienced, everything that they saw, that this was the one image that never left their mind. And the reason it didn't leave their mind is because after those holes had been filled up with dirt, they could still see the ground moving up and down, because not everybody who had been shot had been killed, and the people who were still alive were trying to dig their way out from the bodies and the dirt on top of them. They stayed long enough till the Nazis left and the ground stopped moving, as obviously those people died of suffocation. And my mom and dad knew that they had to go and tell their parents about what they had just seen, so that they might try and do something to protect their families, because now they knew what was going to be happening. So that very night, my dad snuck his own father out of the ghetto, and they went to a farm about 1.5 miles outside of the city. It was the farm of a young man named Joseph Wisniewski, this Polish Christian that they had become friends with long before the war started. He used to bring his goods there, and he was a real happy-go-lucky guy, and they became good, close friends with him. But they hadn't seen him in over a year because Jews and Christians weren't allowed to be together. So they didn't know how he would react to them. And they knocked on the door, he opened it up, and the first thing he did was grab hold of them and start hugging them and ask them how they were doing, at which point my dad told him what he had just seen that day. And then my dad's father looked this young Christian Pole, Joseph Wisniewski, in the eyes and said, "If the time comes and we need it, would you be willing to help us?" And without a moment's hesitation, this young Christian Pole said, "Of course." And they left it at that. Meanwhile, on my mother's side of the family, after she told her father what she had seen, her father's work assignment every day when they found out that he was a builder, a handyman, was they gave him special assignments in their homes, their offices, to build things for them, repair things. So the first day after my mom told her father what she had seen, the Nazis escorted him to his work assignment, told him what they wanted done, and they left him. And the first thing he did was he looked around the room and he found a single brick, and he took that brick and he stuffed it down his pants. Went about his work. 12 hours later, put his coat on. The Nazis came back to where he was working and escorted him back to ghetto. First thing he did when he got to his house is went down to his basement, pulled a brick out of his pants, and hid it away. He kept doing this every single day until he had enough bricks of the same color and the same texture as the bricks that had built his basement wall. And then he went down one Sunday and he proceeded to build a false wall in the basement of his house. And he left just enough room so that in the wall so that each person could lie down on the ground and crawl through to the other side. He cemented some bricks onto a rod so that when he crawled through to the other side, he could take the rod from the inside and pull it in front of the opening so it would look like that was the real wall. He then began to store some non-perishable food and water behind the wall for when the time might come when they would have to hide there. March of 1942, my dad and his father hear a knock on their door very late at night. There's one thing you don't want to hear as a Jew living in the ghetto under the Nazis is a knock on your door, because that could only mean something bad. And my dad and his father go down, they answer the door, and standing there is this young man, 19, 20 years old, and they immediately pull him inside the house. His name is Henryk Gorski, and he is a Christian Pole, and it just so happens that his family was very good friends with my dad's family. And they said, "What are you doing here?" Because he obviously would have been shot dead if the Nazis had caught him sneaking into the ghetto. And he said, my dad has sent me here to warn you that tomorrow the Nazis are going to come into the ghettos and they're going to start rounding up thousands of Jews and take them away. And so how did his father know about that this was going to happen? Because he was still working in the Polish government. And what very few people knew is he was actually working with the Polish underground, and he had built a hideout in his house to hide Jews that the Nazis were looking for. What was his job? He happened to be chief of police of the city, and that's why he knew exactly what the Nazis were going to do, because his own policemen were going to be involved in helping to round the Jews up. And he sent his son there to warn my dad that he had a place that he would hide them out that night for the deportation. Before my dad left with his family, I usually ask people this, what do you think my dad did? So I'll ask you, Juliana, what do you think my dad did?
Probably snuck out and saw your mom.
Absolutely, to warn my mom's family about what was going to happen. And they went down to the basement hideout where they hid out for 24 hours until it was safe for them to come out. And my dad and his family was hidden out at the chief of police, Gorski's house for those 24 hours. 2 weeks later, knock on the door again. Again, Henryk Gorski. Only this time they think it's too dangerous to go back to the chief of police's house, so they decide they'll go to another Christian family's house that they're good friends with. It's also somebody who's still in the Polish government, and it's somebody who's actually working with the chief of police. His name is John Salke, and he happens to be Commissioner of Roads. Why is that important? Because it's the Commissioner of Roads who actually made the work assignments for the Jews. And what nobody knew is that he also was working with the Polish underground. He had built a hideout in his attic to hide Jews. And because of the friendship that he had with my dad's family, he was going to hide them out. My dad once again snuck out to his girlfriend, my mother's house, to warn her family. Only this time the elderly aunt, who was sick, real sick before the war even started, but because of lack of food and medication, she had just gotten much sicker. And she just said, no, I'm too tired, I'm too weak to go and hide. If they want me, let them take me. So my mom and the rest of her brothers and sisters lined up at her bed, kissed their aunt goodnight, and went down to the basement hideout. And that would be the last time that they ever saw her. The Nazis did come into their house the next day. They found her lying in the bed and they took her away. When I was doing research on the book that I wrote about my parents' experience, we found out that the Jews from my parents' hometown were taken to a place called Belzec, which was one of the 6 extermination camps, where she was sent to the gas chambers and then to the crematorium where she was burned. 3 weeks later, knock on the door again. Only this time it's not Henryk Gorski. This time it's the son of John Salke, the man who hid them out the second time. It's his son. And I always like to point this out because of how important it is. Henryk Salke snuck into the ghetto to warn my dad and his family. Henryk Salke was 13 years old. He knew exactly what would happen if he got caught, that he would have been shot dead by the Nazis, yet this 13-year-old boy snuck in to go and warn my dad and his family. Only the message that he had from his father this time was, this would be the last deportations. The Nazis were rounding up the last 2,000 Jews and were going to take them away. And as you remember, as I said before, the Jews had lived in this area of Poland for almost 350 years, and within a matter of 2 months, the Nazis were wiping out any existence that Jews had ever lived there. So this was the time that my dad and his father knew that they had to go to Josef Wisniewski, the young farmer who said he'd be willing to help them, over a year before. And as my dad's mom is getting his little sisters ready to go, my dad looks at his father and says, I have to go see Manya, his girlfriend, one more time. And believe it or not, you can imagine his father looked at him and said, what are you, crazy? Have you lost every ounce of brain you have in your head? The Nazis have encircled the entire city waiting for any Jew to escape, and you want to see your girlfriend one more time. And he looked at his father and he said, I promise you I will meet you at Josef's. And he slipped out the door and made his way to my mom's house one more time. And by this time, all the rest of the Jews knew something was going to happen the next day, so my mom's family was already going down to the basement hideout when he came in. And needless to say, she was very happy to see him, and she said, what are you doing here? And he said, I had to come see you one more time. And then he looked at her and he said, I want you to come and hide with me. Then he said, I want the whole family to come hide with me. And my mom's father thought about it for a moment, and then he said, no, we'd been safe there twice before, we would stay. Why don't you stay with us? And because my dad wanted to be with his girlfriend, my mother, he thought about it. And then he said no, because of the promise he made to his father, and he was afraid if he didn't show up, that his parents would think that he had gotten caught and killed by the Nazis. So he looked at her again and said, please come with me. And now here's the 17-and-a-half-year-old young woman who has a choice to make. That if she goes with this young man that she loves as much as her own family, this person she loves as much as life, the very person she wants to be with for the rest of her life, to start her own family with, that if she goes with him, she knows she might never see her mother, her father, the rest of her brothers and sisters ever alive again. But she also knows that if she stays with her family, she'll probably never see this young man again, and she doesn't know what to do. And the next thing that happened was probably the most incredible thing that any human being could possibly do. I understand you have small kids, Juliana? Her mother took her in her arms and said, it's okay, go with him. Maybe if we're separated, some of us will have a better chance to survive. And what her mother was hoping is that she was sending her daughter to life. But the one thing that her mother was almost assured of is that she was probably never ever going to see her young daughter ever again. And my mother made the decision to go with her boyfriend, my dad. And just as they were about to leave, they turned and looked at my mom's 14-year-old brother, Chaim, and she and he were very close brother and sister, and they said, please come with us. And Chaim said, yes, I want to go. And here was a mother who had just given up her daughter, and she felt she could do no less for her son, and she took Chaim in her arms, hugged him, and said, go with your sister. When they left that night, that would be the last time they ever saw their mother, father, and the rest of their brothers and sisters ever again. They ran out of water, actually, about 2 or 3 days later, and my mom's father snuck out of the ghetto to go get water for his family. And a Christian Pole saw him, knew who he was, recognized him as a Jew, followed him back to his house so that he would know where he lived, and then went to the Nazi headquarters to turn him in for the reward. The Nazis went to the house, they searched it, they found the basement hideout, and they took my mom's mother and father and the rest of her brothers and sisters, marched them outside of the city limits where they shot them dead and buried them in a mass grave. Meanwhile, my mom and dad and Chaim have made it to Joseph Wisniewski's farm. What did this young farmer do? Instead of taking the hay the last time he harvested it back to the market to sell, he stored it at the back of his farm. And then he went out and started building himself a haystack, and he kept building it and building it and building it until it was about 10 or 11 feet high, so that it had this huge base. And then he went out one night and he proceeded to dig the inside of that haystack out. And for the next 6 weeks, my mom, my dad, Chaim, and the rest of my dad's family hid inside of that haystack. The only time they came out was very late at night or very early in the morning, when at risk to their own lives, Gorski, Salki, or Wisniewski would bring them food every single night. And then one night, Gorski informed them that the Nazis were no longer looking for Jews to kill. They had actually brought some back to the ghetto because they needed them for work. But they didn't want old Jews, and they didn't want young Jews. So my dad's parents were too old and his sisters too young. So it was decided that my mom, my dad, and Chaim would sneak into the ghetto because my dad thought he could help his family better from inside of the ghetto. When my dad left the haystack that night, that would be the last time that he ever saw his family alive again. They were informed by Gorski that there was still another large ghetto in a place called Sokół in Poland, so they thought that they would try and make their way there. They got on a train. The train stopped in their hometown of Hrubieszów. Passengers got on, the train started to take off, and then all of a sudden it stopped. One of the passengers who got on recognized my dad's family, knew they were Jews, went to the Nazis on the train and turned them in for the reward. They stopped the train, took them off, and they shot them dead there. Meanwhile, my dad, my mom, and Chaim, and my mom's best friend Tova Bornstein, along with 196 other Jews, are in the ghetto. The work that they had to do was to clean out all the Jewish homes of all the personal belongings, to pack them up where it was sent back to Germany for the Nazi party and the German people. After about 3 months, the Nazis decide too many Jews, not enough work, and they make a selection process. And one of the 100 that's chosen is my mom's brother Chaim, and that's be the last time that she's to see her brother. 2 months later, the Nazis come into the ghetto, round up the last 100 Jews, take them down to the train station where they pack them into cattle cars, and take them off to the first of what would be 13 different labor, concentration, and extermination camps that they would go through over the next 2 years. First place they took them to was a place called Budzin. They emptied out the cattle cars, and as they were marching up to Budzin, my mom and dad and her friend and all the other Jews heard this yelling going on from inside of the camp. And they couldn't figure out what it was until they got much closer. And what was happening is the Jews inside were yelling out family names, trying to find family members if they were being brought in that they had been separated from. They got inside the camp, and they separated them into a men's camp and a women's camp, which meant my mom and dad were no longer able to see each other. My mom and her best friend Tova ended up hooking up with 3 other young women that they would go through all the camps with over the next 2 years. My dad hooked up with 4 young men that he would end up going through all the camps with over the next 2 years. It was about the 3rd or 4th day that my dad found my mother in the food line, and he asked her where her barrack was located. And she explained where it was in the women's camp and what the number was on her barrack. That night, my dad asked his 4 buddies that he shared a bunk with if they would cover for him if the Nazis came in unexpectedly after their normal inspection and count for the barrack. And they said, of course, they'd pull the covers up, or the one blanket that they had over their heads so the Nazis couldn't tell how many of them were lying in the bed. At which point that night, my dad proceeded to sneak out of his barrack, avoided the Nazi guards. He crawled under the barbed wire fence of the men's camp, across the open area under the barbed wire fence of the women's camp, avoided the Nazi guards, found my mother's barrack where he slipped inside and would spend the night there with her. He then got up very early the next morning and would sneak back the same way so that he would be there in time for roll call, because every morning before the sun came up there was roll call where they counted every single Jew to make sure everyone was accounted for. And he did this every single night so that he could be with her. And then one night while he was lying there, he said, "Make me a promise." And she said, "Of course." And he said, "Promise me that if something happens, when this is over, you will meet me back in our hometown of Hrubieszów." And she said, "Of course." Now you have to understand that the help that she was getting from her own 4 friends and the other people in the barrack, because they were allowing them to do this, because if they'd have been caught, they would have punished the entire barrack. And the same thing with my dad, that his buddies would have been killed because they would have known that they were helping him. So it's an incredible thing what people were willing to do and how they helped each other inside of the camps. So about 2 weeks later, the Nazis come in to the women's camp, round them up, and take them away, and that'll be the last time that my mom and dad see each other for about 18 months. My mom went on to 4 more camps. Next camp was a place called Mielec in Poland. Now, when I was 6 years old and growing up in Ponca City, I was sitting in the living room one day with them when I was 6, and it was the first time that I noticed the K and the L tattooed on their wrist, and the A followed by the number 723 on my mom's forearm. And I asked them what it was, and they explained to me, in the least horrifying and the simplest of terms, that they were both Holocaust survivors. It was at Mielec where she got the K and the L tattooed on her wrist that I saw as that 6-year-old little boy. Not all the camps did it. As a matter of fact, very few camps actually put the K and the L on them, and it stood for Konzentrationlager, or a concentration camp, so that if somebody escaped and somebody saw the K and the L, they would know that they were a Jew who had escaped from a camp. From there, my mom was sent to a place called Plaszow. Plaszow you're probably familiar with if you saw the movie Schindler's List, because that's the camp that Oskar Schindler saved those 1,200 Jews from, was in Plaszow that he took them from. From Plaszow, my mom was taken on a long train ride again, and as the train was slowing down, my mom and her friends began to smell some kind of odor that they had never smelled before, and it was just this horrendous odor. And they couldn't figure out what it was. Finally, the train stopped. They opened the cattle car doors, and that smell hit them 100 times worse. And for the first time in all these train trips that they had taken, the train was actually inside of the camp. And they were ordered to line up. And they were lined up, and they had to go in front of an SS colonel. And he looked at every person, and he simply went with his thumb to the right or to the left. 97% of the people were sent one way. My mom, her 4 friends, and some others, although we're very lucky they didn't know it at the time, were sent the other way. And as they were being led away, my mom saw a group of men standing over on the other side of the fence, And she did the same thing there to those men that she had learned in Budzin, and she yelled out, Chaim Nagelstein, looking for her brother. And somebody yelled back from that group of people, yes. And she thought she had found Chaim. And again she yelled out, Chaim Nagelstein. And again the person yelled back, yes. And she saw it wasn't her brother, and the person yelled back to him, I knew him, they took him away yesterday. My mom finally was taken into the barrack with her friends and the other Jewish women. And inside the barrack, they were informed that they had been brought into a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the smell that they had been smelling before the trains even stopped as they were coming in was that of the Jewish bodies that were being burned in the crematorium in the ovens. So my mom knew what it meant when he said they took him away yesterday, that he had been sent to the gas chambers. My mom was very lucky, along with her friends and 295 other young women. They were transferred out of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which very few people were, and they were sent to a camp in Czechoslovakia called Lichtenwerden. In Lichtenwerden, there was an incident that took place with my mom that, after going through the whole war, what had happened, that almost cost her her life. As her punishment for this incident, they took her outside of the barracks. They made her kneel down in sub-freezing weather in 3 feet of snow, and they told her if she as much moved a muscle that they would shoot her dead right there. And they made her kneel in that sub-freezing weather in 3 feet of snow for 24 hours. God only knows how she survived, but with the help of her friends and in the infirmary where she could only be for 2 days, on that 3rd day she was finally able to walk and to go back to work, or she would have been killed. In March of 1945, she was liberated by the Russian forces. She was almost 20 and a half years old. She was 5'1", and she weighed 65 pounds. The Russians just opened the doors and said, you're free to go. They escorted them into the town so that if they wanted, they could get clothes, food, whatever. And my mom and Tova did something for the first time that they had not done in 5.5 years, and that was to take a hot bath. They got fresh clothes, they got food, and true to my mom's promise to my father, at that night in Budzin, she started making her way back to their hometown, where she would wait for my dad to arrive. Meanwhile, my dad ended up going through 7 more camps. He also was sent to Mielec and got the K and the L tattooed on his wrist. From there, he was sent to a place called Wielczyk in Poland, which is where the salt mines were, where he worked in the salt mines for the Nazis. From there, he was sent to a place called Leitmeritz in Czechoslovakia. From there, he was sent to Flossenburg in Germany. From Flossenburg, he was sent to Mauthausen in Austria. From Mauthausen, he was sent to Dachau. From Dachau, he was sent to a subcamp called Koffering. And from Koffering, he was taken out on a death march. On the 2nd night of the death march, they knew that they were going to be killed, so they decided, he and his 4 buddies, that they would try and get away. They waited until they thought the Nazis were asleep, and they started crawling along the ground for about 100 yards, and then they jumped up and started running as fast as their skinny bodies would take them. They finally kept running until they found this barn, where they went inside totally exhausted and fell asleep. They were woken the next morning by this dog barking and somebody singing, and one of my dad's friends went and peeked out the door, and sure enough, it was the German farmer coming to do some chores in his barn. So they knew they had to hide, so they buried themselves underneath the hay in the barn. A couple of moments later, they could hear the door open and feel the dog running around. And yes, the farmer did have to do some chores, and the first thing he had to do was pitch some hay for his livestock. Took the pitchfork, stuck it into the hay, and stuck one of my dad's friends right in the leg. He jumped up and yelled. The farmer's so shocked, he yells. My dad and his other 3 buddies jump up out of the hay, and they all yell, and they're all staring at each other. And they explained to this farmer who they were, that they had just escaped from this Nazi death march, at which point this German farmer then said something incredible. Now, why is it incredible? It is April the 19th, 1945. The war, in essence, is over. The Nazis know they have lost the war. 3 weeks, May 8th, they will sign the surrender and surrender to the Allies. And this farmer looked at them and said, that's why there was a Nazi patrol on my farm last night. They were still sending out patrols to look for these 5 half-dead Jews to kill them. This farmer told them to wait there as though they had a choice. It was broad daylight. They had the prison uniforms on with the Star of David on them, so it's not like they could go marching down the street. So they had to trust him. 20 minutes later, he came back with a basket of food and water and told them that they would have to leave that night, though, because if the Nazis found him there, they would think that he was helping them and they would kill him and his family. So they promised they would leave that night. Got dark, they slipped out the door, they walked 10 feet and said, "Where are we going? We have no idea which way to go. We could be walking right into the Allies, to the Americans, or we could be walking right into the Nazis again." So they decided to go back inside the barn and get another good night's sleep. And they did, and they were woken the next morning by this rumbling sound. One of my dad's friends went and peeked out the door again, and the other four said, "What is it? What is it?" And he turned around and looked at them, and he couldn't talk, and there were tears coming down his face. When my dad told me the story, he said he had only seen this one other time before in his life, and he had seen it in a book in school. Coming down the road were jeeps and trucks with American flags on them. And my dad and his four buddies went outside and were liberated by the American forces. When my dad was liberated, he was 5'9". He was just over 20 years of age, and he weighed 78 pounds. My parents' story is really the story about three miracles. The first is that they even survived in the first place. 90% of Polish Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. In my parents' hometown of Hrubieszów, where there were 8,500 Jews, less than 100 Jews survived the Holocaust in World War II. Second miracle is the fact that they found each other after the war, were reunited. My dad had gone back to his hometown, got my mom out, brought her back to Germany where he was living, and they had a small baby, my brother, who was born in Germany. And the third miracle happened 39 years later when I was doing research on the book, and I found my mother's brother Chaim, who we thought had died in Auschwitz-Birkenau, alive and well and living in Newcastle, England. And on January the 30th, 1982, after 39 years of separation, my mother and her brother at 11:01 British time saw and touched each other.